Hello and welcome. Tonight we travel back in time, far back, about 700 years into the past. Before we start, take a slow breath. Get comfortable. Maybe lower the lights a little, because we are about to walk through a medieval town very early in the morning. Now, imagine the sun is just starting to rise. The sky is pale gray, a little cold. The streets are still quiet, but the town is slowly waking up. You step onto a narrow road made of dirt and stones. The ground is uneven. In some places there are puddles left from last night's rain. In other places, well, it is something else entirely. You might notice the first thing that hits you is not the view. It is the smell. Medieval towns were not famous for fresh air. There were no garbage trucks, no sewers like we have today, and people did not shower every morning with warm water and fancy soap. So yes, the smell could be a little intense, but for the people living here, this was normal. This was everyday life. As the sun climbs higher, you begin to hear sounds coming from small wooden houses. A door opens. A woman steps outside with a bucket. She walks toward the well in the center of the town square. Water is important. Everyone needs it for cooking, drinking, and washing. But getting it is work. There is no faucet in the kitchen. No hot water tap. If you want water, you walk to the well. Sometimes you wait in line. Sometimes the rope is old and rough. Sometimes the bucket splashes a little mud into the water. But this is what people use. Near the well, a few chickens are already awake. They wander across the street like they own the place. Which, to be fair, they kind of do. A baker opens his shop. You can smell fresh bread. And honestly, that smell is a big improvement compared to the street. Inside houses, families are waking up. Many people sleep in the same room. Parents, children, maybe even grandparents. Beds are simple, sometimes just straw stuffed into a mattress. Sheets are not washed often. Washing cloth takes a lot of effort. Water must be carried. Firewood must heat it. Soap is not cheap. So people try to keep things clean in small ways. For example, many people wash their face and hands in the morning. They might use a small bowl of water, maybe a cloth, maybe a little soap if they have it. But a full bath? That is not happening every day. In fact, for many people in the Middle Ages, bathing was something you did only sometimes. Maybe once every few weeks. Maybe at a public bathhouse if the town had one. And even that could be complicated. But we will talk more about bathhouses later. Right now, the town is getting busier. A farmer walks through the street with muddy boots. He smells like animals and hay, because he has already been awake for hours. Farm animals are everywhere in medieval towns. Pigs, chickens, goats, sometimes cows. They move through the streets freely, which means they also leave things behind. Let's just say if you are walking here, you need to watch where you step. And it is not only animals. In many towns, people use chamber pots during the night. These were simple containers kept inside the house. When morning came, the contents had to go somewhere. Sometimes people dumped them into a pit, sometimes into the street, and sometimes out of the window. If you lived in a medieval town, hearing someone shout a warning from above was very important, because nobody wanted a surprise shower from the second floor. Now, before we judge the people too quickly, remember something. They did not have modern plumbing. No underground sewer system. No indoor toilets. No waste treatment plants. People used the solutions they had. Some towns tried to make rules about cleanliness. For example, certain areas were meant for dumping waste. Some streets were cleaned by workers hired by the town. But these systems were not perfect. Not even close. And the smells of daily life mixed together in the air. Smoke from fireplaces. Animals. Food cooking. Leather being treated by craftsmen. Waste from homes. It was a strong mix. Still, people lived full lives here. They laughed. They worked. They raised families. For them, this world felt normal. Children run across the street now, chasing each other. One of them carries a wooden toy sword. Another pretends to be a knight. A dog barks somewhere nearby. A blacksmith begins hammering metal in his workshop. The sound echoes down the narrow street. Clang, clang, clang. Slowly the town becomes alive. Market stalls are set up in the square. Farmers bring vegetables. Fishermen bring their catch from the river. Traders arrive with cloth, spices, and tools. And everywhere, people move through the busy streets. They greet neighbors. They argue about prices. They carry baskets and tools. Life in the Middle Ages was not easy. Hygiene was very different from what we know today. People had fewer ways to stay clean, fewer resources, and much less knowledge about bacteria and disease. But they did what they could. Some washed daily. Some used herbs to stay fresh. Some visited bathhouses when possible. Others simply accepted the smells and dirt as part of life. And honestly, after living here long enough, you might get used to it too. The human nose can adapt to many things, even medieval mornings. So as the sun finally rises above the rooftops, the town is now fully awake. The streets are crowded. The sounds of work fill the air. And our journey into the world of medieval hygiene is just beginning. Because in the next chapter, we will explore something very interesting. What people in the Middle Ages actually believed about cleanliness. And you might be surprised to learn that sometimes people believed bathing too much could make you sick. Strange idea, right? But in the medieval world, many things worked very differently. Chapter 2: Medieval Ideas about Cleanliness. To understand hygiene in the Middle Ages, we first need to understand how people thought about the human body, because their ideas were very different from ours. Today, if someone asks why we wash our hands, the answer is simple. Germs, bacteria, viruses, tiny invisible things that can make us sick. But medieval people had never heard of germs. The microscope would not be invented for many centuries, so nobody knew that invisible organisms were spreading disease. Instead, doctors in the Middle Ages believed in something called the four humors. This idea actually came from ancient Greek medicine. It was taught by famous thinkers like Hippocrates and Galen, and by medieval times, most doctors in Europe believed it completely. According to this theory, the human body was controlled by four important fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Yes, phlegm made the list. These four humors had to stay in balance. If they were balanced, a person was healthy. If they became unbalanced, a person could become sick. Simple as that. So when someone had a fever, stomach pain, or strange mood changes, doctors believed the humors were out of balance. And many medical treatments were meant to fix that balance. Sometimes doctors used herbs, sometimes special diets, and sometimes they used bloodletting, which meant removing blood from the body to restore balance. It sounds a little scary today, but at the time, people believed it made sense. Now you might wonder, what does this have to do with bathing? Well, here is where things get interesting. Medieval doctors believed the body had tiny openings in the skin called pores. These pores allowed things to move in and out of the body: heat, air, moisture, and other mysterious forces. Bathing in hot water was thought to open these pores, and that could be dangerous, because if your pores were open, bad air or disease might enter your body more easily. So in some situations, doctors warned people not to bathe too often, especially during times when disease was spreading. It sounds strange to us today, but remember, they were working with the knowledge they had. And in their minds, protecting the body from harmful air was very important. In fact, many people believed diseases traveled through something called miasma. Miasma was the idea that sickness came from bad smells and dirty air. If air smelled terrible, people believed it was full of disease. And honestly, medieval towns did smell pretty terrible sometimes. So the idea did not seem completely unreasonable. To protect themselves from miasma, people used all kinds of methods. They burned incense. They carried herbs. They wore small pouches filled with flowers or spices. Some doctors even recommended holding sweet-smelling plants near your nose when walking through the city. It was like an early version of air freshener, but portable. Perfumes and scented oils also became popular among wealthier people, not only because they smelled nice, but because they were believed to protect against sickness. And sometimes, strong smells were actually considered healthy. Doctors believed certain scents could strengthen the body and help the humors stay balanced. So while medieval people did care about cleanliness, their reasons were very different from ours. Today we wash to remove bacteria. Back then, people washed to stay fresh, comfortable, or socially acceptable. But they were not always trying to remove invisible germs, because they did not know those germs existed. Religion also played a role in how people viewed cleanliness. Christian teachings often talked about spiritual purity. Being clean on the inside, meaning morally good, was often considered more important than being physically clean. Of course, this did not mean people ignored washing completely. Many monasteries actually had strict rules about washing hands and faces, but the main focus was often spiritual discipline rather than medical hygiene. Meanwhile, everyday people followed habits that made sense in their world. They washed when water was available. They changed clothes when they could. They combed their hair and tried to keep pests away. But bathing the whole body regularly was not always common, partly because of beliefs about health, and partly because it was simply difficult. Heating enough water for a full bath required a lot of firewood. Carrying water from wells took time and energy, and large tubs were not common in small homes. So most people used simpler methods. A basin of water, a cloth, maybe a bit of soap. They washed their hands, face, and sometimes their feet. This was often called a partial wash. It was quicker, easier, and required much less water. And honestly, it probably helped more than we might expect. Clean clothes also played a big role in medieval hygiene. Even if people did not bathe often, they sometimes changed linen undergarments. These layers absorbed sweat and dirt from the body, so washing clothes could help people stay cleaner overall. In fact, historians today believe medieval hygiene was not always as terrible as movies sometimes show. Yes, conditions were rough. Yes, streets could be messy, but many people still tried to keep themselves reasonably clean, just using different ideas and tools than we have today. And those ideas shaped the entire medieval world, from medicine to bathing habits, to the way people thought about health and disease. But one challenge affected everyone in the Middle Ages, no matter if you were rich or poor, and that challenge was water, because getting clean water was not always easy. In the next chapter, we will explore wells, rivers, and the daily struggle to find water in medieval towns. And we will see why something as simple as a bucket of water could sometimes decide how clean or how dirty a whole community became. Chapter 3: The Search for Clean Water. Water may seem like a simple thing. Today you walk into the kitchen, turn a handle, and clean water flows out of a tap. Cold water, hot water, as much as you want. Feels normal, almost boring. But in the Middle Ages, water was not always easy to get. And clean water was even harder. Every single bucket had to come from somewhere. In most medieval towns, the main source of water was a well. You would usually find it in the center of the town square, or sometimes inside a courtyard. A deep hole in the ground, lined with stone, reaching down to underground water. If you wanted water, you walked there with a bucket. Sometimes 2 buckets, sometimes 3. People lowered a rope down into the well, filled the bucket, and slowly pulled it back up again. It sounds simple, but water is heavy. A full bucket can weigh more than 10 kilograms. So carrying water home every day was real work. And this job was usually done many times a day. Water was needed for drinking, cooking, washing hands, cleaning tools, feeding animals, and sometimes washing clothes. In busy towns, the well could become a crowded place. Early in the morning, people lined up with wooden buckets, clay jars, or leather containers. They talked, shared news, and sometimes argued about who had been waiting the longest. But there was another problem. Just because water came from a well did not always mean it was clean. Sometimes wells became contaminated. Rainwater could carry dirt and waste into the ground. Nearby animals could affect the water. And if a well was not protected properly, things could fall inside. Even small contamination could affect the whole town. If the water tasted strange, people noticed quickly. But sometimes dangerous problems were invisible. And remember, nobody knew about bacteria yet. So people judged water mostly by taste, smell, and appearance. If it looked clear and smelled normal, it was usually considered safe. Rivers were another important source of water. Many medieval towns were built near rivers for this reason. Rivers made travel easier, helped trade, and provided water for daily life. But rivers had their own problems. They were often used for many things at the same time. People washed clothes in the river. Animals drank from the river. Tanners, who worked with animal hides to make leather, sometimes cleaned their materials there. And sometimes waste from the town ended up in the same water. So while rivers were useful, they were not always the cleanest place to collect drinking water. Some towns tried to solve this problem with clever ideas. In larger medieval cities, engineers built water systems using pipes or wooden channels. These systems carried fresh water from springs outside the city into public fountains. These fountains became important gathering places. People filled buckets there, washed vegetables, and sometimes splashed their faces on hot days. For many towns, having a reliable fountain was a sign of progress. But even then, water still had to be carried home by hand. No pumps, no electric pressure, just human muscles. Rainwater was also collected in some homes. People placed barrels under roof edges to catch rain as it flowed down. This water could be used for washing or cleaning. But rainwater was not always perfect either. If roofs were dirty, the water might carry dust, bird droppings, or bits of straw from thatched roofs. Still, people used whatever water they could find. And because collecting water required so much effort, it was often used carefully. Large full-body baths were not practical every day. Heating that much water would take time, firewood, and patience. Instead, people focused on smaller washes. A bowl of water for the face, a cloth for the hands, maybe a quick rinse of the feet after a long day. In wealthier homes, servants sometimes helped carry water and prepare baths. But for most people, water remained something valuable. You did not waste it. You used just enough, and sometimes not as often as modern people might expect. Water also played an important role in cooking and brewing drinks. In fact, many people drank ale or small beer more often than plain water. This might sound strange, but there was a reason. During brewing, water was boiled. Boiling killed many harmful organisms, even though people did not understand exactly why. The result was a drink that could sometimes be safer than untreated water. Small beer usually had very low alcohol. It was mild and weak, and even children sometimes drank it. It was simply part of daily life. Still, water remained essential. Without wells, rivers, fountains, or rain barrels, medieval towns could not survive. And because water was so important, protecting these sources became a serious concern. Some towns created laws about what people could dump near wells. Others built stone walls around water sources to protect them. But accidents still happened. And sometimes a town had to dig a brand new well if the old one became unusable. Life without reliable water was extremely difficult. Imagine trying to cook dinner, wash your hands, or clean clothes when every drop must be carried from far away. It changes the way you think about cleanliness. Suddenly, washing your whole body every day becomes a luxury, and people begin to find other solutions. One of those solutions became surprisingly popular during parts of the Middle Ages. A place where people could relax, talk with friends, and actually enjoy a warm bath. These places were called bathhouses, and in the next chapter we will step inside one of them. because despite the difficult conditions of medieval life, public bathhouses once became lively centers of cleanliness and sometimes a little bit of fun. Chapter 4: Public Bathhouses. In the Middle Ages, water was a precious resource. There were no taps, no showers, no instant hot water, no running pipes. Every bucket had to be carried by hand, and heating enough water for a full bath was a serious effort. You had to build a fire, heat a huge cauldron of water, and then carry it carefully without spilling it everywhere. So a daily bath? That was a luxury most people couldn't imagine. And yet, in many towns, people found a way to bathe, socialize, and relax all in one place. Public bathhouses. These bathhouses were nothing like the spas we think of today. No fluffy towels, no ambient music, no scented candles. They were usually simple buildings made of wood or stone, with large wooden tubs or sometimes stone basins. Some tubs could fit several people at once. Others were small and just for a few. Steam filled the air, the smell was a mix of wood smoke, wet bodies, soap when they had it, and the faint traces of townsfolk smells from outside. So it wasn't exactly relaxing in a modern sense, but it was cleaner than the streets, at least. The water in the bathhouse had to be heated. Workers would stoke fires under big cauldrons to warm it. Sometimes they used multiple fires to heat enough water for dozens of people. The effort involved was enormous. Because of this, most bathhouses charged a small fee, and people paid it. Warm water was rare, and it felt like a treat, a tiny bit of luxury in otherwise hard lives. Inside, visitors would strip down and enter the tubs. Some wore light cloths, others didn't. It depended on the town, the bathhouse, and perhaps how shy or confident you were. For many, stepping into warm water after a long day of manual labor, fields, workshops, streets, was magical. Dirt softened, sweat washed away, and muscles relaxed. For a short while, the harsh realities of medieval life, mud, smoke, cramped spaces, hard labor, could be forgotten. Bathhouses weren't just about cleaning. They were social hubs. People chatted, laughed, told stories, and caught up on news. Travelers stopped by after long journeys. Friends met to gossip. Sometimes the room echoed with laughter and splashes as clumsy bathers tipped over a bucket or two. It was lively, noisy, and human. For many, bathhouses were as much about community as hygiene. Some bathhouses offered extra services. Workers could scrub your back with a rough cloth or brush, wash your hair, or even help trim beards. In some cities, wealthier bathhouses offered food and drink. Imagine sitting in warm water, steam rising all around, while someone brings bread, cheese, or a mug of mild ale. Not quite a spa experience by modern standards, but for medieval people it was a treat, a moment of comfort in hard lives. However, not all bathhouses were purely wholesome. Over time, some developed reputations for entertainment of a less innocent sort. People drank, joked loudly, flirted. Mixed bathing men and women in the same tubs was common in many cities, which made religious authorities uncomfortable. They worried about morality and sometimes intervened, creating rules or separating men and women by time slots. Still, the bathhouses remained busy and lively. Bathhouses were especially popular before the Black Death. In the early 1300s, cities like Paris, London, and Cologne had dozens of them. People used them for bathing, socializing, and relaxing. Bathhouses became a part of town life. They offered warmth, a way to clean up after hard work, and a rare chance to enjoy a bit of comfort and community. Then came the plague. The Black Death arrived in Europe around the mid-1300s, killing millions of people. Nobody knew what caused it. Some blamed bad air. Some believed it was divine punishment. Some thought it spread through contaminated objects. And suddenly, bathhouses were seen as potentially dangerous. Remember the medieval idea about pores? Doctors believed hot water opened pores, allowing dangerous bad air to enter the body. The very act of bathing, which once helped people feel clean and healthy, now became suspect. Fear spread. Some bathhouses closed either by city orders or because people avoided them. Public bathing slowly declined in many towns. People still washed themselves at home with bowls, basins, and cloths, but the lively social bathhouse culture faded. It was a strange twist. A place that once promoted cleanliness became feared and avoided. Still, for centuries, bathhouses had played an essential role in urban life. They offered something rare: warmth, cleanliness, and a moment of human comfort. Imagine finishing a long day working in the fields, your hands caked in mud, your back sore, your clothes smelling of smoke and sweat. Stepping into a bathhouse, feeling warm water around your body, muscles relaxing, and chatting with friends. Those moments must have felt incredible. Even if only occasionally, they were small escapes from the hard reality of medieval life. Wealth also played a role. Nobles and wealthy townsfolk could afford private baths or exclusive access to bathhouses. Poorer people might visit less often, but even then, the bathhouse represented a shared experience. It was a place where, for a little while, everyone could feel human, clean, and connected in a world that could be dirty, noisy, and exhausting. Even for those who could not visit bathhouses, medieval people developed other habits to stay clean. They used basins and bowls, washed faces, hands, and feet, combed their hair, and changed undergarments when possible. Simple routines helped manage hygiene between visits to public baths. It wasn't perfect by modern standards, but it worked well enough for daily life. Bathhouses also reflected social life and culture. They were places to meet, gossip, exchange news, and even conduct minor business. Sometimes, visiting a bathhouse was about health, sometimes about socializing, and sometimes just about enjoying warm water and a brief escape from chores and work. In a way, bathhouses were about more than hygiene. They were about comfort, community, and humanity. They gave people a break from the hard, often dirty reality of medieval towns. Warm water, steam, and social connection. A tiny piece of relief in a world where daily life was difficult and often smelly. By the end of the Middle Ages, public bathhouses had declined, in part because of disease fears, changing social norms, and moral concerns. But their legacy remained. They were a reminder that even in a world without modern plumbing, people found ways to care for their bodies, enjoy a moment of warmth, and connect with others. And for ordinary people who couldn't visit these bathhouses regularly, life went on with simpler methods. Bowls, cloths, and small daily habits became the main way to stay clean. But for those rare moments in a bathhouse, people could relax, laugh, and feel just a little more comfortable in a world that was often far from it. Next, we will look at everyday washing habits, the ways medieval people managed hygiene when bathhouses weren't an option. You might be surprised by how clever and sometimes grossly practical their methods were. Chapter 5: Everyday Washing Habits. Most people in the Middle Ages didn't go to bathhouses every day. In fact, many rarely went at all. So how did they stay clean? The answer is small, practical routines. Things that didn't require hauling buckets of water, heating cauldrons, or walking miles to a well. One of the most common ways people washed was with a basin of water and a cloth. They'd fill a wooden bowl or small tub with water, sometimes warm, sometimes cold from the well, and use a cloth to wash their hands, faces, and sometimes feet. Not a full-body bath, but it helped. And because water was heavy and scarce, small washes were much easier and more practical than filling a full tub. Hands were particularly important. People handled food, coins, tools, and animals every day. Washing hands before eating or cooking wasn't just for comfort. It was practical. Some monasteries had strict rules about hand washing. Monks washed before meals and often several times a day. For ordinary townsfolk, habits varied, but most people understood that dirty hands could lead to problems, even if they didn't know about germs. Face washing was another daily ritual. Dirt, smoke from fires, and sweat could make the skin grimy. A quick rinse or rub with a cloth helped people feel fresher and a little lighter. Sometimes, herbs or vinegar were added to the water to improve the smell or clean the skin better. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. And honestly, after a long day walking through dusty streets or working in the fields, even a small splash of water could feel amazing. Feet were also important to clean. Most people walked everywhere on streets that were muddy, dusty, or worse. Animals roamed freely, leaving, let's say, evidence behind. Dirty feet could lead to sores, infections, or just plain discomfort. Washing them in a basin helped prevent problems and made shoes or barefoot walking a little more tolerable. Full-body baths were less common. They were usually done weekly or sometimes less frequently because filling a large tub, heating it, and bathing in it was a lot of work. People sometimes bathed at home if they had the resources, or in a public bathhouse when available. But most of the time, people relied on partial washes, hands, face, and feet, and clean clothes to stay presentable. Speaking of clothes, they played a huge role in hygiene. Most people didn't bathe often, but they could change undergarments more frequently. Linen shirts or shifts, which were worn next to the skin, could be washed, scrubbed, and aired in the sun. This removed sweat, dirt, and odors. Changing clothes was a smart way to feel cleaner without using too much water. Wealthier people sometimes even layered their clothing. An undergarment could be changed daily, while outer garments might last longer. Hair was another focus. Combs were common even among ordinary people. Brushing or combing hair helped remove lice, dirt, and tangles. Some people washed their hair in small basins with water and herbs. Shampoo, as we know it, didn't exist, but people used herbs, vinegar, or soap scraps to clean hair and improve the smell. Hair care was practical but also a way to look respectable in town. Barber surgeons were sometimes involved in hygiene too. They didn't just cut hair and shave beards. They also helped remove lice or treat minor infections. Hair trimming and grooming were practical as well as social. A clean head of hair or a neatly trimmed beard made people feel healthier, more comfortable, and socially acceptable. For women, washing often included careful attention to hands, faces, and hair. Long hair required extra care to avoid tangles, lice, and grime. Women might braid their hair or cover it with cloth to protect it from dust and dirt. Some used herbal rinses to keep hair manageable or to make it smell better. Practical and a little fancy depending on what they had available. Children had their own routines, often supervised by parents. Faces, hands, and feet were washed regularly, and clothes were changed. Full baths for children were less common but could be done occasionally. Parents did their best to keep them comfortable and reduce infections, even if they lacked modern soap and running water. Even with all these routines, smells were an everyday challenge. People used herbs, flowers, and scented oils to mask odors. Carrying a small pouch of dried herbs or flowers, called a posy, was common. These could be sniffed when the air smelled bad, or even carried around for a faintly pleasant aroma in crowded streets. It wasn't perfect, but it made life in smoky, muddy, or smelly towns more tolerable. Public washing areas also played a role. Wells, rivers, and fountains could be used for washing hands, faces, or even clothes. People used them sparingly, though, because water was a valuable resource. Even a quick rinse or splash made a difference and allowed people to maintain some level of cleanliness without wasting water. Despite what movies sometimes show, medieval hygiene wasn't always terrible. People understood practical ways to stay relatively clean and comfortable, given the limitations. They adapted to their environment, the scarcity of water, and the tools they had. Simple routines, basins, cloths, changing undergarments, brushing hair, kept them functional, healthy, and socially presentable. Interestingly, these habits also reveal something about medieval life. Hygiene was not just about removing dirt. It was about comfort, practicality, and social expectation. Being clean meant being able to work, eat, travel, and interact with others. It meant feeling human in a world where labor, mud, and smoke were constants. Even a small basin of water could make a huge difference in how a person felt each day. Some people were surprisingly creative with hygiene. For example, vinegar or herbs in the washing water could help with smells, and clothing changes helped compensate for infrequent baths. Comb and brush routines helped manage lice, tangles, and oil in the hair. Even tiny gestures, wiping hands, splashing a bit of water on the face, were part of a larger system that kept people functioning and somewhat comfortable. In summary, everyday washing habits in the Middle Ages were about making do with what was available. Full baths were rare, warm water was precious, and travel to a bathhouse could be time-consuming. But partial washes, careful hair care, changing clothes, and using herbs allowed people to stay reasonably clean. These small routines, combined with occasional trips to public baths, helped medieval people manage hygiene in a world without modern plumbing. In the next chapter, we'll explore teeth and dental care. Even though toothbrushes and toothpaste didn't exist as we know them, people had clever, and sometimes surprising, ways to care for their teeth. Some methods were effective, some less so, but it shows how creative humans have. Chapter 6: Teeth and Dental Care. In the Middle Ages, teeth were a constant problem. People didn't have toothbrushes, toothpaste, or dental floss like we do today. Cavities, gum disease, and toothaches were incredibly common. And yet, medieval people were surprisingly inventive when it came to dental care. They didn't have modern solutions, but they made do with what they had. Some methods were practical, some a bit odd, and some honestly a little gross, but they worked well enough to keep most people chewing for a while. One of the most common tools for dental care was the chewing stick. This was usually a small twig, often from a tree believed to have beneficial properties, like willow, sage, or juniper. People would chew on one end until it became soft and frayed, then rub it against their teeth. It acted like a primitive toothbrush. Chewing sticks helped remove bits of food stuck in teeth, and certain trees had natural antiseptic properties that could reduce decay or bad breath. Using a stick might sound strange now, but it was surprisingly effective for a time when modern dental care didn't exist. Another popular method was rubbing teeth with a cloth. People sometimes used rough linen or even soft animal skins, sometimes combined with salt, ashes, or powdered herbs. Salt acted as a mild cleanser and could even whiten teeth slightly. Ashes, usually from wood fires, were abrasive and helped scrape off plaque. Herbs like mint, sage, or rosemary were added to improve the smell of the mouth and to give a sensation of freshness. Yes, it probably didn't taste great, but it worked for basic hygiene. Wealthier townspeople sometimes had access to tooth powders. These were made from crushed bones, eggshells, or various herbs, and sometimes even powdered charcoal. People rubbed the powders directly on their teeth to clean them. Some powders were flavored with herbs to freshen breath. Imagine rubbing a mix of crushed eggshells and sage onto your teeth. Not exactly the minty freshness we expect today, but it removed debris and helped maintain some oral hygiene. Rinsing the mouth was another method. Water alone was often used, but vinegar and herbal rinses were popular too. Swishing water with herbs or a bit of vinegar helped remove food particles, and it was believed to kill harmful bad air that could make the mouth or body unhealthy. Herbs such as rosemary, sage, thyme, and mint were commonly used, not only for taste but also for their supposed medicinal properties. Even though people didn't understand germs, they noticed that rinsing made their mouths feel cleaner and fresher. Despite these efforts, dental problems were widespread. Toothaches were extremely common and could be brutal. Without proper dental care, infections often developed, and people had very few options. Barber surgeons sometimes helped, performing extractions with rudimentary tools. Pulling a tooth with pliers or scissors without anesthesia was as painful as it sounds. But for many, it was better than living with a rotten, infected tooth that could cause fevers, swelling, or even death. Home remedies were also widely used. People applied clove oil, crushed herbs, or honey to aching teeth. Cloves had a natural numbing effect and helped relieve pain temporarily. Honey, aside from being sweet, had mild antibacterial properties and could help coat the tooth or gums. Some remedies were more creative, like using crushed roots or minerals. Effectiveness varied, but it shows how people tried to manage dental problems with the resources they had. Diet also played a crucial role in dental health. Sugar was rare and expensive in much of Europe, so cavities were less common than they would be after sugar became widespread centuries later. Most people ate bread, vegetables, cheese, and occasionally meat. Coarse bread, in particular, could act as a natural toothbrush of sorts. The grinding texture helped scrape food and plaque from teeth while chewing. Meat and hard grains also required chewing, which naturally cleaned teeth. Children's teeth were another concern. Kids often suffered from toothaches or decay. Parents used simple tools like chewing sticks, rinses, or rubbing herbs on gums to manage discomfort. Some children's remedies were similar to adults, but parents tried to focus on preventing serious problems. Still, children often lost teeth early due to decay or infection, and without anesthesia, extractions were harsh but necessary. Social status influenced dental hygiene too. Wealthy people could afford better powders, herbs, and professional care. They might have access to finer tooth powders, flavored rinses, or a barber surgeon to attend to serious problems. Poorer people relied on basic sticks, cloths, water, and whatever herbs they could find. But ingenuity was universal. Even people with limited resources found ways to reduce discomfort, manage smells, and try to keep teeth functional. Speaking of smells, bad breath was a social problem. People noticed it and tried to deal with it. Herbs, spiced rinses, and chewing sticks were not only about hygiene, they also helped mask unpleasant odors. In crowded towns, marketplaces, or churches, a fresher-smelling mouth was appreciated. Posies and scented herbs helped further. Sometimes people carried small pouches to sniff if needed. Medieval hygiene wasn't perfect, but it was practical. Interestingly, medieval people linked dental care to overall health. Clean teeth and gums were thought to prevent broader illness. While they didn't know about bacteria, they did notice patterns. People with poor dental care often had fevers, infections, or digestive problems. Even if the reasoning was off, the effort to maintain oral hygiene was grounded in observation and practicality. All in all, teeth and dental care in the Middle Ages were a mix of simple hygiene, herbal remedies, and occasional professional help. It wasn't perfect, but it was surprisingly effective for the time. Chewing sticks, powders, cloths, herbal rinses, and a little common sense helped people manage what could have been serious problems. Toothaches remained common, but creative methods allowed medieval people to keep eating, speaking, and surviving. In summary, dental hygiene was challenging, but medieval people found ways to deal with it. They couldn't prevent every cavity, nor did they have easy pain relief, but the combination of chewing sticks, rinses, cloths, herbal powders, and diet gave them some control over a problem that could otherwise be unbearable. It wasn't modern dentistry, but it worked well enough to keep most people functional. In the next chapter, we'll look at laundry and clothing hygiene, which was another surprisingly important aspect of daily life. Clothes weren't just about fashion. They were essential for comfort, warmth, and maintaining some level of cleanliness. Washing them was far from easy, and medieval people developed clever methods to make it work. Chapter 7: Laundry and Clothing Hygiene. In the Middle Ages, keeping clothes clean was almost as challenging as keeping the body clean. Most people didn't have endless supplies of clothing, and washing was hard work. But clothes were essential, not just for modesty or fashion, but for comfort and hygiene. Dirty clothes could harbor smells, germs, and pests, so medieval people had to be creative about keeping them reasonably clean. Most people wore a shift or undergarment next to the skin. This was usually linen, a breathable fabric that could be washed more often than outer garments. The shift absorbed sweat, body oils, and dirt, so even if the outer clothing remained a little grimy, the shift helped protect the skin and keep people feeling fresher. Shifts were usually washed every week or two, depending on access to water and the effort involved. Outer clothing, like tunics, dresses, or cloaks, was washed less often. These garments were heavier, often woolen, and took a lot more effort to clean. Wool also didn't like to be soaked too much, or it could shrink or become stiff. So people found workarounds. For example, they might air out woolen clothes by hanging them outside in the sun and wind. Sunlight could kill some germs, and the breeze helped remove smells. Clothes could also be beaten with a stick or shaken to remove dust and dirt. It wasn't perfect, but it made a difference. For those who could afford it, laundering could involve a lot more effort. Wealthy people sometimes had servants or laundresses who would wash, rinse, and even starch clothes. Starching made fabric stiffer, helped maintain shape, and also had the bonus of making the cloth smell cleaner for a while. Laundry for the wealthy could involve multiple steps. Soaking, scrubbing, rinsing, and drying. It could take a whole day or more for a few garments. Most ordinary people, however, had simpler routines. They used wooden tubs, basins, or rivers. Water had to be carried from a well or a stream, heated over a fire if needed, and then used carefully. Soap was available in some regions but was expensive. When people had soap, it was usually made from animal fat and ash. Harsh by modern standards, but it worked. If no soap was available, people relied on rubbing, beating, or rinsing in water alone. Clothes were scrubbed on washboards or flat stones, or even beaten with sticks. Beating the clothes helped remove embedded dirt and dust. After washing, garments were wrung out and hung to dry. Drying was a challenge in damp weather, so people would hang clothes near fireplaces, on lines, or over bushes outside. Sun and wind were their allies. Even simple air and sunlight helped reduce smells and refresh clothing. Some items, like undergarments or shirts, were washed more frequently, while outer layers were spot cleaned as needed. People might rub out stains, sprinkle herbs on fabric to mask odors, or even use vinegar to freshen up garments. For medieval people, clothing hygiene was as much about maintaining comfort and social respectability as it was about cleanliness. A clean shirt might not prevent disease, but it made life more bearable and improved social interactions. Interestingly, some methods were surprisingly clever. For example, sprinkling powdered chalk or flour on wool could absorb oils and odors. Hanging clothes in the sun not only dried them but also helped kill some parasites. Herbs like rosemary, lavender, or thyme were sometimes added to water or rubbed on clothes to improve scent. Medieval people were resourceful. They didn't have washing machines, but they found ways to make clothes wearable and presentable. Footwear was another important part of clothing hygiene. Shoes and boots were often made of leather and could become dirty or smelly. People cleaned them by brushing off dirt and sometimes rubbing with oils or fats to condition the leather. Clean feet and reasonably maintained shoes helped reduce discomfort and prevent infections or sores. Children's clothing was washed carefully, as kids tended to get very dirty playing outdoors. Linens, tunics, and undergarments were rinsed or scrubbed, sometimes multiple times a week if possible. Infants were often wrapped in swaddling cloths, which were washed frequently to manage hygiene. Laundry in towns could also involve communal efforts. Some towns had shared washing spaces like rivers or public washhouses. Women would gather at these spots to wash clothes, sometimes working together in teams. It was hard work, involving standing for hours in cold water, scrubbing, rinsing, and wringing. But it also became a social activity. Women talked, shared news, and sometimes even traded herbs or tips for cleaning stubborn stains. Despite all these efforts, medieval clothing hygiene was limited by resources. Water was heavy to carry, soap was expensive, and large, heavy garments were difficult to wash. People balanced effort, necessity, and practicality. Full laundering might be rare, but partial cleaning, airing, and herbal freshening were often enough to keep clothes reasonably clean between full washes. Smells were managed creatively. Herbs and flowers were sprinkled on clothes, inside collars, or in pockets. Some people wore scented ribbons or pouches. If a garment smelled bad, it could be temporarily masked until it could be washed properly. In crowded towns with streets full of animals, waste, and smoke, these small tricks made a big difference. Laundry also reflected social class. Wealthy individuals could afford frequent washing, professional laundresses, and better quality soap. Poorer people relied on water, beating, airing, and herbs. Yet across classes, the goal was the same: clothes that were wearable, comfortable, and socially acceptable. Even small steps mattered in a world where bathing was rare and clothing expensive. In conclusion, clothing hygiene in the Middle Ages was a mix of practical effort, clever techniques, and occasional luxury. People washed what they could, aired what they couldn't, and used herbs and natural remedies to keep garments fresh. Laundry was hard, messy work, but it was a crucial part of medieval life. Clean clothes helped people feel comfortable, maintain appearances, and protect their bodies from the dirt and grime of daily life. In the next chapter, we'll explore pests and parasites, because even with clean clothes and bodies, medieval people had to deal with lice, fleas, and other unwelcome roommates. And some of the ways they managed these tiny invaders are, well, creative, to say the least. Chapter 8: Pests and Parasites. Even if medieval people washed themselves occasionally, used basins, visited bathhouses, and laundered their clothes, they still had a persistent problem: pests and parasites. Lice, fleas, ticks, and bedbugs were everywhere. People lived closely with animals on straw floors, in crowded homes, and in towns with streets full of mud and waste. So keeping clean wasn't just about comfort. It was about surviving in a world where tiny invaders could make life miserable. Let's start with lice. Lice were the most common parasite people dealt with. Hair lice infested scalps, while body lice lived in clothing and bedding. Head lice were itchy, annoying, and sometimes caused infections from scratching. Body lice could spread disease in cramped conditions. People didn't understand germs the way we do today, but they knew lice were bad news. One of the main ways people fought lice was by combing. Fine-toothed combs, often made of wood, bone, or metal, were used to pull lice and nits, lice eggs, out of hair. This was tedious work, and it had to be done regularly. Some families made it a routine. Children's hair combed daily, adults perhaps a few times a week. Comb, rinse again. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked to reduce the population of lice. People also tried herbs and oils to manage lice. Rosemary, thyme, rue, and lavender were rubbed into the hair or infused into water for rinsing. Some people believed these plants kept pests away. Others made pastes or powders to rub on clothes, bedding, or hair. It wasn't perfect, but the combination of combing and herbal treatments could make life a little less itchy. Fleas were another nuisance, especially for people living with animals. Many homes had dogs, cats, chickens, or pigs. Fleas jumped from animals to humans, biting and causing irritation. People tried to keep animals and sleeping areas clean, although that was easier said than done. Herbs like rosemary, sage, and mint were sometimes scattered on straw bedding to repel fleas. People also shook out mats, blankets, and clothes regularly, hoping to dislodge unwanted guests. Bedbugs were common in straw mattresses and wooden beds. People often slept on layers of straw, which could harbor insects. To deal with bedbugs, they burned straw periodically, replaced bedding, and sometimes sprinkled herbs like rue or wormwood. Some people even used smoke, keeping a small fire or incense in the room to drive insects away. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it helped reduce infestations. Ticks were another hazard, especially in rural areas. People who worked in fields, forests, or pastures were vulnerable. Ticks could attach to the skin, bite, and sometimes spread disease. People checked themselves after outdoor work, removed ticks carefully, and sometimes used herbal oils to soothe bites. Wearing boots or covering arms and legs also helped reduce exposure. Interestingly, medieval people sometimes turned pest control into a social and cultural practice. Women often had responsibility for combing children's hair, cleaning bedding, and placing herbs in the home. Men working with animals learned to check for fleas or ticks. Communities sometimes shared tips for pest management, passing down herbal remedies, washing routines, or clever tricks for keeping pests away. Clothing hygiene played a major role in controlling pests. Body lice thrived in unwashed garments, so changing undergarments regularly and airing outer clothing helped prevent infestations. Washing clothes in rivers, basins, or bathhouses removed some lice and eggs. Hanging clothes in the sun, beating them, and sprinkling herbs all contributed. Clean clothes weren't just about appearance, they were a first line of defense against pests. Even with these methods, complete protection was impossible. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs were persistent. People tolerated some discomfort as a fact of life. It was common to see adults scratching heads or children complaining of itchy bites. Medieval people accepted pests as part of their daily existence, while doing what they could to reduce their impact. Animals were both helpers and contributors to the problem. Cats and dogs could chase away some pests, but they also carried fleas. Chickens and pigs sometimes brought lice or mites. People who lived in rural areas had to balance caring for animals with controlling pests in their homes. It was a delicate dance, and one that required constant attention. Herbal remedies were surprisingly clever. People used a mix of strong scents, oils, and powders to make life uncomfortable for pests. Rue, wormwood, mint, rosemary, lavender. These were scattered in hair, bedding, or clothes. Smoke was used in some regions to fumigate rooms. Even if it didn't eliminate pests completely, these methods reduced bites and irritation. Some communities developed more extreme measures. Infested bedding might be burned or replaced entirely. People occasionally shaved heads to remove head lice. Flea and bedbug infestations could prompt thorough cleaning, burning straw, or fumigating spaces. Medieval people were resourceful, using everything from fire to herbs to try and keep pests under control. Despite the nuisance, medieval people didn't always panic about pests. Scratching, cleaning, combing, airing clothes, and using herbs were normal routines. Kids might complain, adults might grumble, but life went on. Pests were part of the environment, something to manage rather than eliminate entirely. In a way, medieval pest control was a mix of practical hygiene and clever improvisation. People observed patterns, experimented with herbs and oils, and passed down effective methods. They didn't have chemicals, vacuum cleaners, or modern medicine, but they had ingenuity and persistence. Over time, these routines reduced discomfort and prevented serious infestations from overwhelming a household. Even today, thinking about medieval life, we can't ignore pests. They were everywhere. In hair, clothing, bedding, and homes. People dealt with them constantly. Yet despite these challenges, they still bathed occasionally, laundered clothes, brushed teeth, and used herbs to stay as clean as possible. Pests were a reminder that hygiene wasn't just about appearances. It was about comfort, health, and survival in a world without modern conveniences. By combining combing, herbal treatments, careful laundering, airing bedding, and some clever improvisation, medieval people managed pests well enough to live with them. Life was itchy and sometimes gross, but it was survivable. And in the next chapter, we'll explore medicinal herbs and home remedies, which were used not only for pests but for general hygiene and health. Medieval people relied on nature in ways that were both practical and surprisingly smart. Chapter 9: Medicinal Herbs and Home Remedies. In the Middle Ages, medicine and hygiene were closely linked. People didn't have modern medicine, antiseptics, or disinfectants, so they relied heavily on medicinal herbs and home remedies. Herbs weren't just for cooking. They were the first line of defense against disease, infection, and general discomfort. And while some remedies sound strange to us now, they were clever solutions to real problems. One of the most common uses of herbs was for cleaning and freshening the body. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, and sage were staples. People would crush or steep these herbs in water to make baths, rinses, or washes. Lavender was especially popular for its smell, but it was also thought to repel insects and bad air. Rosemary and thyme had antiseptic properties, so adding them to water could help prevent infection in cuts or scrapes. Herbs were also used in hair care. People rinsed hair with herbal infusions to remove dirt, grease, or lice. Sage, rue, and chamomile were common. Chamomile could lighten hair, while sage or rue helped repel pests. A quick rinse with an herbal solution wasn't just practical. It also made hair smell better and sometimes look shinier. People didn't have modern shampoo, but herbs filled that gap surprisingly well. For teeth and oral hygiene, herbs played a major role. Mint, sage, and rosemary were often chewed or powdered to freshen breath. Some people even rubbed herbs on teeth or gums to remove debris or soothe inflammation. Cloves were particularly prized for numbing toothaches. Imagine sitting in your small home, chewing a clove or swishing rosemary water around your mouth. Primitive dental care, yes, but it worked for short-term relief. Herbs weren't only for hygiene, they were used for minor injuries and infections too. Cuts, scrapes, and burns were treated with herbal poultices. Plantain leaves, for example, were mashed and applied to wounds to help them heal faster and reduce swelling. Honey was another common ingredient in these remedies. It acted as an antibacterial agent, keeping wounds clean and protected from dirt or flies. Even without understanding germs, medieval people noticed that honey and certain herbs helped wounds heal better. Skin care relied heavily on herbs as well. People made pastes or balms with herbs to soothe rashes, bites, or irritated skin. Chamomile, marigold, and comfrey were favorites. These plants were mashed, mixed with water, or combined with animal fats to create soothing ointments. Not luxurious by modern standards, but effective. Medieval people were practical. If it worked, it stayed in use for generations. Some herbs were used to mask odors, especially in crowded cities. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, mint, and sage were common. People carried small pouches, tucked herbs into clothing, or sprinkled them on bedding. In a world without deodorants, perfumes, or modern air fresheners, these simple plants made life more tolerable. Even if you didn't smell like a spa, at least you didn't smell like the street or your neighbor's animals. Herbs were also important in bathing routines. Even small baths could be improved with herbs. People steeped leaves in hot water, creating herbal infusions. Bathing in this water helped reduce skin irritation, mask odors, and even repel lice or fleas. Wealthier households sometimes used elaborate herbal baths with multiple ingredients, while ordinary townsfolk kept it simple, just a few sprigs of rosemary or lavender in a basin of warm water. Hand washing and minor hygiene also benefited from herbs. Rinsing hands or face in herbal water removed dirt, softened the skin, and helped prevent minor infections. People didn't understand bacteria, but they knew that washing with certain plants felt better and reduced unpleasant odors. Herbs were a kind of early hygiene technology. In addition to hygiene, herbs were often part of folk medicine. People believed that proper hygiene and herbal remedies could prevent disease or treat minor ailments. Chamomile tea could calm the stomach, sage tea could reduce fevers, and thyme or rosemary infusions could soothe colds. While these treatments weren't cures in the modern sense, they improved comfort and helped people feel healthier. Herbs were also used in household cleaning. Floors, bedding, and clothing were sometimes sprinkled with powdered herbs or washed in herbal water. Strong scents helped mask odors and deter pests. People recognized that a clean, herb-scented home was healthier and more pleasant, even if they didn't understand germs. Even in rural areas, people relied on locally available plants. Dandelion, nettle, rue, lavender, and mint were common in gardens or fields. People learned which plants worked for skin, hair, teeth, and hygiene. This knowledge was passed down through families, forming a practical herbal tradition that combined observation, trial, and experience. Children learned about herbs early. Mothers or caregivers taught them which plants were safe to use on the skin, for washing hair, or for oral care. Kids helped prepare herbal rinses, poultices, and balms. It was part of growing up in a world where hygiene and medicine were intertwined with daily life and nature. Even pests were managed with herbs. As discussed in the previous chapter, lice, fleas, and bedbugs could be repelled with aromatic plants. Herbs were rubbed into hair, sprinkled in bedding, or placed in clothing to reduce infestations. This was a clever, low-tech way of controlling pests when soap and chemical repellents didn't exist. In summary, medicinal herbs and home remedies were central to medieval hygiene. People used plants for bathing, hair care, oral care, wound treatment, skin care, and odor management. They were practical, accessible, and surprisingly effective. Even without modern science, medieval people understood the power of plants and incorporated them into daily routines to stay clean, comfortable, and healthy. By combining baths, laundering, partial washing, herbal rinses, and other home remedies, medieval people created a surprisingly effective system for hygiene. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly didn't meet modern standards, but it was enough to make life tolerable and even somewhat pleasant in a world without running water, soap, or modern medicine. In the next chapter, we'll dive into toilets, privies, and waste management, because handling human waste was one of the biggest challenges for medieval hygiene, and one of the smelliest, too. We'll see how people managed this daily necessity with surprisingly practical solutions. Chapter 10: Toilets, Privies, and Waste Management. One of the biggest challenges for medieval hygiene wasn't washing, it was dealing with human waste. Without modern sewage systems, flush toilets, or running water, medieval people had to get creative. Managing waste safely, or at least semi-safely, was crucial for survival in towns, villages, and castles. Most people used simple privies or latrines, which were basic holes or pits dug in the ground. In rural areas, these might be just a trench at the edge of the farm or garden. In towns, privies were sometimes built over cesspits. People would sit or squat over them, do their business, and then cover it with soil, straw, or ash. It wasn't glamorous and it smelled, but it worked. In castles or larger houses, privies were often attached to the walls and sometimes even had a rudimentary chute that dropped waste into a moat, stream, or cesspit below. Yes, medieval plumbing existed in a very basic form. Nobles could enjoy a bit more privacy and convenience, but the underlying problem, managing human waste, remained the same. For townsfolk, sanitation was a bigger problem. Streets were narrow and crowded, and waste disposal was haphazard. People often threw chamber pot contents out of windows into the street. This created a messy, smelly environment, especially in larger cities. Pigs, dogs, and other animals often helped clean up, scavenging scraps and, well, human waste. Not ideal, but it was part of the ecosystem. Some medieval cities implemented rules to manage waste. Towns sometimes required citizens to empty cesspits regularly, cover waste with lime or soil, and avoid dumping directly into streets or rivers. Enforcement was spotty, but these rules show that medieval people understood the importance of managing waste to reduce smells and disease. Chamber pots were a common household solution. People kept small pots by their beds for nighttime use. The contents would be emptied into privies, rivers, or designated waste areas the next day. Chamber pots were practical, especially in cold weather or in crowded homes. Some were simple clay pots, while wealthier families might have more ornate containers. Interestingly, some medieval hygiene practices involved ashes, straw, and sand. After using the privy or chamber pot, people often sprinkled ash, straw, or sand over the waste. This helped absorb moisture, reduce odor, and manage flies. Ash was particularly useful because it also had mild antiseptic properties. This simple trick made waste management slightly less unbearable. In castles and monasteries, privies could be surprisingly sophisticated. Some were built with wooden seats, stone foundations, and even channels to direct waste away from living areas. In larger monasteries, latrines might be communal and connected to a running stream that carried waste away. Monks had rules for using these facilities, sometimes even assigning specific times for different groups. Cleanliness was tied to discipline as well as practicality. For rural peasants, waste management was simpler but still functional. Latrines or pits were dug a safe distance from homes and wells. When pits filled, they were covered, and a new one was dug. This rotation helped reduce smells and contamination. People sometimes repurposed human waste as fertilizer for fields, recognizing its value for crops. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical and sustainable. In towns, public latrines were sometimes available. These were basic communal facilities, often with wooden benches and holes over pits or flowing water. They provided a semi-private solution in crowded streets and markets. Maintenance was usually minimal, so cleanliness varied. People relied on personal habits, using ash, covering waste, and washing hands afterward to reduce the risks of disease. Speaking of hands, hand washing after using the toilet was important, even if people didn't understand germs. Some rinsed with water, others used herbs or vinegar. This helped remove waste particles and reduce smells. Medieval people understood that contact with human waste could cause discomfort, illness, or infections, even if they didn't know why. Simple hand washing and cleanliness rituals were surprisingly effective. Odor management was a constant concern. People burned herbs, scattered aromatic plants, or placed sweet-smelling flowers in privies. Strong scents helped mask unpleasant smells. It wasn't perfect, but it made the environment more tolerable. Cities often struggled because dense populations, open waste, and narrow streets made odors unavoidable. But personal measures, combined with simple architectural tricks like running water or ventilation, helped. For children, chamber pots or small privies were used. Kids learned from parents where and how to relieve themselves. Hygiene education was practical. Wash hands, cover waste, and use the facilities properly. It was part of growing up in a world where sanitation depended on careful management and daily attention. Rivers and streams were another key element. Many towns and villages were built near water for drinking, washing, and waste disposal. Unfortunately, this meant that human waste sometimes entered water sources. People recognized the problem, but options were limited. Regulations in some cities tried to control direct dumping, but enforcement was inconsistent. Still, flowing water helped carry away waste, reducing the concentration of smells and contamination near homes. In summary, medieval waste management was a mix of practical engineering, household effort, and social rules. Privies, chamber pots, pits, rivers, ashes, and herbs all played a role. It wasn't clean by modern standards, but it worked for a world without modern plumbing. People managed to live, work, and function despite the smells and challenges. Managing waste wasn't just about comfort, it was about health, practicality, and survival. Improper handling could lead to disease, foul living conditions, and even epidemics. Medieval people recognized this, and their methods, while crude, were surprisingly effective. Rotating latrines, using ash or straw, washing hands, and careful disposal all helped reduce risk. By combining baths, basins, laundry, herbs, pest control, and careful waste management, medieval people created a surprisingly functional system for hygiene in a world that lacked modern conveniences. It was labor-intensive, smelly at times, and far from perfect, but it allowed people to survive and even feel somewhat clean and comfortable in challenging conditions. Next, we'll explore disease and hygiene, because the connection between cleanliness and health becomes very clear in times of plague and epidemics. How medieval people tried to stay healthy, avoid infection, and survive despite limited knowledge is both fascinating and terrifying. Chapter 11: Disease and Hygiene. In the Middle Ages, hygiene wasn't just about comfort or social norms. It could literally mean the difference between life and death. Disease was a constant threat, and people knew, at least intuitively, that cleanliness helped prevent illness. Of course, they didn't have modern science or germ theory, but observation and experience taught them valuable lessons about hygiene and health. One of the most infamous examples of disease in the medieval period was the Black Death. Plague swept across Europe in the 14th century, killing millions. People quickly realized that crowded, filthy conditions made infections worse. Streets clogged with waste, rodents carrying fleas, and poorly ventilated homes created an environment where disease spread like wildfire. Even without understanding bacteria, people noticed patterns. Filth and pests were associated with sickness. Hand-washing became important during outbreaks, though it was more instinct than science. Monks, nuns, and some townspeople used herbal rinses or vinegar to clean hands and faces. People avoided touching waste, scavenged animals, or dirty clothing. Even partial washing and rinsing made a noticeable difference in comfort and, indirectly, in disease prevention. Public health measures varied, but some cities implemented surprisingly effective regulations. Town councils issued rules about disposing of waste, cleaning streets, and keeping animals out of living spaces. Wells and fountains were sometimes protected to prevent contamination. While enforcement was inconsistent, these efforts showed that medieval people recognized the connection between hygiene and health. Clothing and laundry played a role in disease prevention too. Frequent changing of undergarments and shifts removed sweat, oils, and dirt that could harbor pests. Outer garments were aired or sprinkled with herbs to reduce smells and repel insects. Even if full bathing was rare, clean clothes helped prevent skin irritation, lice infestations, and secondary infections. Clothing hygiene was practical and preventive. Bathing habits also influenced health. While full-body baths were infrequent for most people, occasional immersion in warm water with herbs helped reduce parasites and clean the skin. Wealthy households sometimes had herbal baths, while townspeople used basins, rivers, or streams. Even small routines, washing hands, face, and feet, reduced grime and the presence of pests, indirectly lowering the risk of disease. Diet and nutrition intersected with hygiene as well. People observed that poor diet weakened the body and made illness more likely. Eating fresh bread, vegetables, and occasional protein supported health. Contaminated or spoiled food, on the other hand, could cause gastrointestinal infections. Boiling water, washing produce in rivers or basins, and cooking thoroughly were practical ways to reduce illness risk, even if people didn't understand microbes. Quarantine and isolation were sometimes used during outbreaks. Entire households, neighborhoods, or towns might be cordoned off to limit the spread of plague or other diseases. While medieval people didn't know about germs, they recognized that close contact with the sick led to more illness. Hygiene measures like washing, airing clothing, and burning contaminated bedding were practical attempts to contain disease. Herbs played a surprising role in preventing and treating illness. People used rosemary, sage, thyme, and lavender not only for pests but also for general health. Herbal teas, poultices, and washes were common. Chamomile could soothe stomachaches. Garlic was believed to boost immunity, and vinegar or wine infused with herbs was used for wounds or infections. These remedies often didn't cure serious diseases, but they improved comfort and sometimes reduced secondary infections. Pests were another vector of disease. Fleas, lice, and ticks spread infections, including plague. Medieval people tried to control these pests with clothing hygiene, herbal repellents, and regular cleaning. Even without understanding bacteria or fleas, reducing infestations helped lower the risk of illness. Clever observation and practical measures sometimes saved lives, even in the absence of modern medicine. Monasteries and religious institutions often emphasized personal hygiene as part of spiritual and physical health. Monks and nuns washed hands before meals, cleaned living areas, and maintained modest bathing routines. Hygiene was linked to discipline, which indirectly reduced disease risk. These practices also influenced laypeople, who observed and sometimes adopted similar routines. Children and infants were especially vulnerable. Parents washed faces, hands, and feet, changed clothing, and sometimes applied herbal poultices to minor cuts. Babies were swaddled in clean cloths and occasionally bathed. These practices, simple as they were, helped prevent infections in a world with no antibiotics. Interestingly, medieval people sometimes combined superstition and hygiene. Some believed that foul smells caused disease, which led to practices like burning herbs, hanging flowers, and using aromatic oils. While the reasoning was incorrect, the results were beneficial. Scented herbs often repelled insects, covered odors, and encouraged regular cleaning of clothing and bedding. Practical hygiene and superstition often worked hand in hand. Even funerals and handling the sick had hygiene considerations. People used gloves, cloths, and herbs to limit contact with disease. Homes with sick family members might be aired, bedding changed, and personal items washed in water or vinegar. While crude, these practices helped slow the spread of infections within households. Despite the limitations of knowledge, medieval hygiene was more sophisticated than we often imagine. People observed cause and effect patterns, experimented with herbs and routines, and implemented communal and personal strategies to stay healthy. Baths, basins, laundry, pest control, waste management, and herbal remedies all contributed to reducing disease risk. In summary, disease and hygiene were inseparable in medieval life. Even without germ theory, people understood that filth, pests, and close contact with waste and sick individuals led to illness. They combated these threats with a mix of personal hygiene, laundry, baths, herbal remedies, hand washing, and practical rules. Life wasn't germ-free, but these measures improved survival, comfort, and quality of life in a challenging environment. The lesson from medieval hygiene is clear. Observation, practicality, and ingenuity mattered as much as knowledge. People survived, thrived, and even found ways to feel relatively clean in a world without running water, soap, or antibiotics. Next, we'll explore public bathhouses and communal hygiene, which were a major part of medieval life, both for cleanliness and social interaction. Some of the practices are funny, surprising, and sometimes shocking, but they reveal how medieval people balanced hygiene, culture, and community. Chapter 12: Public Bathhouses and Communal Hygiene. Public bathhouses were one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval hygiene. Even though most people bathed at home with a basin or in rivers, bathhouses offered a chance to clean more thoroughly and socialize while doing it. They were more than just a place to get rid of dirt. They were hubs of community life, gossip, and sometimes scandal. Bathhouses were common in towns and cities, especially where water was abundant. Rivers, streams, or aqueduct-fed pools provided the necessary supply, and the wealthy or municipal authorities often maintained the facilities. The basic setup usually included a large pool or series of pools, a heating system for warm water, and benches or changing areas. People might pay a small fee for entry, though some bathhouses were free or subsidized. The process of bathing at a public bathhouse was different from what we do today. First, visitors would undress in a changing area. Privacy was limited, sometimes minimal, so social norms and modesty mattered. In wealthier bathhouses, there were private or semi-private rooms, but in most towns, bathing was communal. People bathed together, sometimes by gender and sometimes in mixed groups, depending on local customs. Inside, the pools were often warm, heated by fires beneath or by channeling hot water from nearby sources. Patrons would soak for relaxation and cleansing. Many people used herbal infusions in the water, lavender, rosemary, or chamomile, to improve smell and reduce pests. Bathing wasn't just about hygiene. It was also about comfort, socializing, and even a bit of luxury. After soaking, visitors scrubbed themselves with cloths, brushes, or sponges. Soap, when available, might be used, but it was not universal. Scrubbing helped remove sweat, dirt, and dead skin, while soaking loosened grime. People sometimes used oils afterward to moisturize the skin and leave a pleasant scent. Even simple herbs added a sense of cleanliness and well-being. Bathhouses also played a role in disease prevention, at least in theory. Regular bathing reduced lice infestations, improved skin health, and allowed people to notice cuts or sores that needed care. Bath attendants might apply herbal washes or help clean hard-to-reach areas. Wealthy bathhouses sometimes had attendants dedicated to hygiene rituals, while ordinary town bathhouses relied on patrons doing most of the work themselves. Interestingly, bathhouses were also social hubs. People discussed news, politics, and local gossip while soaking in the warm water. Some bathhouses had special rooms for conversation or relaxation. For medieval townsfolk, this communal aspect was important. Bathing became both a hygienic and social activity. It wasn't uncommon to meet neighbors, trade tips on herbal remedies, or even conduct small business in these spaces. Despite the benefits, bathhouses had risks. Communal bathing could spread skin infections, lice, or fungal conditions. Water quality varied. Sometimes it was clean, other times stagnant. People noticed odors, and hygiene varied depending on how well the facility was maintained. Still, for many, the advantages outweighed the risks. Bathing in a large pool, using warm water, and socializing was a rare pleasure in an otherwise labor-intensive life. Bathhouses also reflected class differences. Wealthy patrons could afford private rooms, better heated water, and access to herbal treatments. Ordinary townsfolk shared communal facilities, sometimes in less than ideal conditions. Even so, public bathhouses democratized hygiene in a way. Rich and poor could, in theory, access bathing facilities even if quality varied. Children were often introduced to bathhouses gradually. Families might supervise them, ensuring safety and teaching proper routines. Young people learned early how to scrub, rinse, and manage personal hygiene in communal settings. The lessons went beyond cleanliness. They reinforced social etiquette, cooperation, and modesty. Bathhouses were also places for ritual cleansing and preparation. People often bathed before important events, religious observances, or festivals. A clean body was associated with moral and spiritual purity. Monasteries sometimes had small communal baths for monks, emphasizing ritual cleanliness alongside discipline. Cleanliness wasn't only physical. It had cultural and spiritual significance. In addition to hygiene and socializing, bathhouses occasionally had health-related services. Some offered herbal infusions, massages, or minor treatments for skin conditions. Patrons could consult attendants about remedies for minor ailments, combining bathing with practical care. Even without modern medicine, bathhouses served multiple functions: hygiene, relaxation, socialization, and basic health management. The design of bathhouses varied by region. Some had multiple pools at different temperatures, similar to modern spas. Others were simple single pools with benches. Privacy, warmth, and ventilation were key considerations. Heating water and maintaining cleanliness were labor-intensive, so bathhouse operators had to manage both resources and patrons effectively. Despite their popularity, bathhouses sometimes gained a bad reputation. Because they were social and communal, stories of flirtation, gossip, or scandal emerged. Some authorities criticized them for moral reasons, claiming they encouraged inappropriate behavior. Yet for most people, the practical benefits of bathing and social interaction outweighed moral concerns. Bathhouses remained an important part of urban hygiene for centuries. Even in rural areas, communal bathing existed. Villagers might gather at a river, stream, or natural hot spring for washing and social interaction. These gatherings were similar in function to urban bathhouses: cleaning, gossiping, and sharing remedies, but less formal. Nature served as the bathhouse, and herbs, stones, or sand might be used to scrub and freshen the skin. In summary, public bathhouses were an essential part of medieval hygiene. They provided a space for full-body washing, relaxation, socializing, and sometimes minor medical care. While communal baths carried some risks of disease and moral scrutiny, they were a practical and valued part of life. Bathhouses complemented home washing, laundering, and herbal remedies, helping people maintain personal cleanliness in a challenging environment. By combining home hygiene, laundry, pest control, herbal remedies, and public bathing, medieval people created a surprisingly sophisticated system. Life was labor-intensive, smells were common, and disease was ever-present. But they managed to stay functional, relatively clean, and socially engaged. Bathhouses were a central piece of that puzzle, hygienic, social, and occasionally indulgent. In the next chapter, we'll explore medical beliefs about cleanliness, where we'll see how religion, superstition, and observation all shaped the ways medieval people understood hygiene and health. Some beliefs were surprisingly accurate, others less so, but all influenced daily practices. Chapter 13: Medical Beliefs about Cleanliness. In the Middle Ages, hygiene wasn't just about looking or smelling decent. It was deeply tied to medical beliefs. People didn't know about germs, bacteria, or viruses, but they had ideas about what made someone sick and how cleanliness could help. Some of these ideas were surprisingly smart, some a little off, but all of them shaped how people bathed, washed, and cared for themselves. The main medical system in medieval Europe was based on the humor theory, inherited from the ancient Greeks. According to this, the body had four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant these humors were balanced. Disease meant they were out of whack. People believed that filth, bad smells, or unclean substances could upset this balance. So, washing and cleaning weren't just for comfort. They were seen as essential for keeping your humors in check. Bathing and washing were recommended for both hygiene and health. Using clean water, herbal infusions, and scrubbing the skin helped remove what people thought were harmful substances. Even if the reasoning was wrong, the practical effect was good. Washing reduced dirt, grime, and pests, which did actually improve health. So, medieval people were sometimes right for the wrong reasons. Medical treatments often connected to hygiene, too. For instance, bloodletting or minor surgeries required tools that had to be cleaned. Doctors and barber surgeons often wiped instruments with vinegar or wine to prevent corruption of the humors. While they didn't know about germs, they did notice that using dirty tools could make patients sicker. Clean hands, clothing, and instruments were considered safer. Smells were a big deal because of miasma theory. People thought bad air or miasma caused disease. Rotting matter, stagnant water, and waste were dangerous. To fight this, herbs, incense, and fresh air were used. Lavender, rosemary, and rue weren't just pleasant. They were considered protective. Walking through clean-smelling streets, airing rooms, and bathing often were seen as ways to prevent illness. Interestingly, these methods also helped reduce fleas, lice, and other pests. Diet was part of hygiene, too. Food was classified as hot, cold, moist, or dry, and eating properly balanced foods was thought to keep humors healthy. People washed vegetables, soaked grains, and cooked meat thoroughly to remove impurities. Even without germ theory, these routines unintentionally made food safer and reduced illness. Monasteries emphasized hygiene as part of spiritual and physical health. Monks and nuns washed their hands before meals, cleaned their cells, and sometimes bathed regularly. They also laundered clothing and bedding, often adding herbs for scent and protection. While their motivation was partly religious, it also had health benefits. Clean hands, bedding, and utensils reduced the spread of lice, fleas, and minor infections. Herbs were central to hygiene and medical care. People used rosemary, sage, thyme, lavender, and chamomile for baths, washes, teas, and poultices. Herbs were believed to purify the body, restore balance, and prevent disease. Some of these remedies worked in practice. Chamomile soothes the skin, rosemary can repel pests, and sage has mild antiseptic properties. Medieval people learned through observation and trial and error what helped. Clothing and personal hygiene were linked to medical theory. Clean shifts and undergarments were thought to prevent humoral imbalance. Dirty or damp clothes were considered dangerous because they could contaminate the body. Laundry, airing garments, and using herbs in clothing were practical steps to prevent discomfort and reduce parasites. Even partial cleaning was helpful. Bathhouses reflected medical beliefs too. Bathing wasn't just about smell, it was therapeutic. Warm water, herbal infusions, and soaking were believed to remove toxins and restore balance. Patrons thought baths could improve circulation, reduce fever, or ease aches. While some beliefs were wrong, the results were positive. Clean skin, parasite removal, and relaxation. Pests, waste, and communal hygiene were also influenced by medical ideas. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs weren't just irritating. They were thought to cause disease or imbalance. Cleaning bedding, laundering clothes, airing rooms, and using herbal repellents were seen as protective measures. Even without understanding microbes, these practices reduced infestations and improved comfort. Public health rules in towns reflected these beliefs. Councils issued regulations about waste disposal, street cleaning, and keeping animals away from homes. People intuitively knew that filth and bad smells caused sickness, so local ordinances reinforced hygiene practices. Enforcement was inconsistent, but the logic was clear. Clean streets, clean homes, and clean water reduced illness. Superstition also mixed with medical hygiene. Protective charms, holy water, and blessed herbs were thought to ward off disease. While magical thinking was involved, people often combined these measures with practical cleaning. Scrubbing with herbal water or carrying rosemary pouches was both comforting and effective against pests or minor infections. Children learned hygiene in this context. Parents taught them to wash hands, bathe, and keep clothing clean. They learned which herbs were useful, how to manage smells, and how to avoid contaminated water or waste. Even without germ theory, these routines improved their comfort and helped prevent minor illnesses. In summary, medical beliefs strongly influenced medieval hygiene. Filth, foul air, pests, and dirty clothing were associated with sickness. Baths, laundering, herbal remedies, pest control, and waste management were all guided by observation, tradition, and theory. Life wasn't germ-free, but these practices helped people stay healthier, cleaner, and more comfortable than you might expect. Even with limited knowledge, medieval people created effective routines by combining observation, trial and error, and belief systems. Baths, laundry, herbs, and cleanliness practices all had practical benefits. Life was hard, disease was everywhere, and modern conveniences didn't exist, but people found ways to manage hygiene and protect their health as best they could. The next chapter will look at sleep and hygiene, exploring how clean bodies, bedding, and routines influenced one of the most essential activities, resting at night. Medieval bedrooms, mattresses, and night habits reveal surprising insights into their understanding of hygiene, comfort, and health. Chapter 14: Sleep and Hygiene. Sleep in the Middle Ages wasn't just about rest, it was closely tied to hygiene and comfort. People didn't have mattresses stuffed with memory foam, fancy pillows, or nightly showers, but they did have routines and strategies to stay as clean and comfortable as possible while sleeping. Considering the crowded homes, pests, and limited bathing, it was no small challenge to get a decent night's rest. For most people, beds were simple. Straw mattresses were the norm for peasants, while wealthier households might have feather-stuffed mattresses. Straw was cheap, easily replaced, and could be aired out in the sun to reduce pests and smells. Feathers were more luxurious, softer, and sometimes lightly scented with herbs to ward off fleas or lice. Bedding cleanliness mattered, not just for comfort but for health. Sleeping on dirty, damp straw or feathers invited lice, fleas, and bedbugs. A typical medieval bed setup included a mattress, blankets, and sometimes a sheet or coverlet. Even if full washing was rare, bedding was aired out regularly. People often beat mattresses, shook out blankets, and sprinkled herbs like lavender, rosemary, or rue on straw to repel insects and mask odors. Sunlight was also a natural disinfectant. Fresh air, combined with herbs, helped reduce infestations and kept bedding tolerable. Nightwear was important too. People usually slept in long shifts or simple garments rather than pajamas. These garments were changed regularly and washed when possible. Clean clothing reduced the risk of skin irritation and kept lice or fleas from settling on the body. Even partial hygiene routines, changing undergarments or rinsing face and hands before bed, made a noticeable difference in comfort. Hand washing and face washing before bed were common, particularly among wealthier people or in monastic settings. Hands and face could carry dirt, sweat, and oil from the day, and washing before sleep helped prevent skin irritation and discomfort. For children, parents might rub hands, feet, and faces with water or herbal rinses, teaching good habits from an early age. Sleep hygiene was also influenced by pests. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrived in bedding and close quarters. People combed hair before bed, applied herbal powders, and sometimes shook out clothing and straw. Sleeping near animals was risky. They brought fleas, lice, and mites. Wealthy households often kept animals in separate areas, while poorer families tolerated animals in the same room. Herbs, smoke, and routine cleaning helped reduce the discomfort and spread of parasites. Temperature and ventilation were part of the hygiene equation. People knew that stale, damp air could cause discomfort and illness. Sleeping rooms were aired whenever possible, windows or shutters were opened, and straw was replaced or fluffed to improve airflow. Even small adjustments, like opening a window or sprinkling straw with herbs, improved sleep quality and comfort. In towns and crowded homes, beds were often shared. Families slept together, sometimes in bunk arrangements, to conserve warmth. Shared sleeping meant cleanliness was even more important. Dirt, sweat, and pests spread easily, so routines like combing hair, airing bedding, and sprinkling herbs were vital for everyone's comfort. Communal sleeping required cooperation, attention, and consistent hygiene practices. Public baths and communal washing influenced sleep hygiene too. People who bathed in the evening were cleaner going to bed, which reduced irritation, odor, and pests in the bedding. Herbal rinses, warm water, and careful scrubbing all contributed to a more comfortable night. Even if a full bath wasn't possible, washing key areas like the face, hands, and feet before bed helped people sleep better. The wealthy had additional strategies for comfort. Feather mattresses, multiple blankets, and pillowcases were changed regularly and often scented with herbs. Some even had canopies over beds to protect against drafts and pests. These measures weren't just for luxury, they were practical. Reducing exposure to cold, drafts, and pests improved sleep quality and overall health. Children and infants had special attention. Babies were swaddled in clean cloths, placed on fresh straw or mattresses, and sometimes sprinkled with herbs to prevent pests. Parents monitored bedding, changed garments, and ensured the sleeping area was as hygienic as possible. Clean bedding and clothing helped prevent rashes, irritation, and the spread of lice or fleas, which could be particularly troublesome for young children. Even religion played a role in sleep hygiene. Monks, nuns, and devout families emphasized clean living and cleanliness before bed. Ritual washing, airing sleeping areas, and maintaining personal hygiene were part of spiritual discipline as well as practical health. Clean hands, faces, and bedding were linked to moral and physical well-being, reinforcing the idea that hygiene mattered in every aspect of life. Nighttime routines also included minor herbal remedies. Lavender and rosemary were commonly used, either sprinkled on bedding or placed in small sachets. The scents were pleasant, repelled pests, and had a calming effect, helping people relax before sleep. Chamomile or other calming herbs might be brewed into teas or infusions, particularly for children or the sick. These practices combined hygiene, comfort, and practical medicine. Finally, sleep hygiene intersected with disease prevention. Clean bedding, regular washing, and airing rooms reduced the spread of lice, fleas, and other pests. Changing nightwear and keeping sleeping areas as clean as possible helped prevent rashes, infections, and general discomfort. Even without understanding germs, medieval people noticed the practical benefits of sleep hygiene for health and comfort. In summary, medieval sleep hygiene involved more than just lying down at night. Beds, mattresses, blankets, clothing, herbs, airing rooms, washing, and pest management all combined to create a system for safer, more comfortable sleep. Life was crowded, smells were common, and pests were a constant nuisance, but people adapted. By observing the effects of cleanliness and discomfort, they developed routines that maximized comfort and minimized health risks. Medieval sleep hygiene reminds us that even in a world without modern conveniences, people were inventive. Straw mattresses, herbal sachets, washing routines, and airing bedding may sound primitive to us, but they made a real difference. Comfort, cleanliness, and sleep were deeply connected, and medieval people managed to balance them remarkably well. Next, we'll explore cultural attitudes toward hygiene, examining how society, religion, and social norms shaped the way people thought about cleanliness, personal care, and public behavior. Understanding attitudes is key to seeing why hygiene practices were adopted, and sometimes ignored. Chapter 15: Cultural Attitudes Toward Hygiene. Hygiene in the Middle Ages wasn't just practical. It was also shaped by culture, religion, and social norms. People didn't have running water or modern soap, but they had ideas about what was proper, modest, and acceptable when it came to cleanliness. These attitudes influenced when people bathed, how often they washed, what clothing they wore, and even how they thought about smells. Religious beliefs played a major role. In many Christian communities, cleanliness was linked to spiritual purity. A clean body symbolized a pure soul, and washing was sometimes considered a moral obligation. Monks and nuns followed strict hygiene routines, washing hands before meals, bathing occasionally, and keeping living quarters tidy. These habits weren't just for comfort. They were part of discipline, devotion, and a sense of order in daily life. Bathing was also influenced by social class. Wealthier people had access to private baths, herbal-infused water, and attendants to help maintain cleanliness. Their clothing was washed, aired, and often scented with herbs. Ordinary townsfolk or peasants had to rely on simpler routines, washing with a basin, bathing in rivers, or using herbal rinses. Despite these differences, hygiene was valued across classes, even if the methods varied. Public perception of hygiene could also be surprising. Cleanliness was sometimes associated with vanity or indulgence. Some moralists criticized public baths, claiming that excessive bathing led to immorality, flirtation, or laziness. In literature and sermons, you can find warnings against people spending too much time in warm water, mixing with others, or showing off their appearance. Bathing was practical, but social attitudes could make it controversial. On the other hand, bathing and cleanliness were often celebrated in folk culture. Herbs, scented waters, and clean clothing were appreciated for comfort, smell, and health. People enjoyed the sensory benefits of being clean. Pleasant smells, smooth skin, and the relief of removing dirt and sweat. Cleanliness was linked to attractiveness, social acceptance, and personal pride. Even if moralists frowned upon excessive bathing, the population generally valued it. Cultural norms also shaped gendered hygiene practices. Men and women had different routines, reflecting both social expectations and practical needs. Women often took care to wash faces, hands, and hair, especially before social or religious events. Men focused on body washing, hair combing, and grooming to maintain a respectable appearance. Bathhouses sometimes separated genders, though not always strictly, and cultural expectations influenced how people behaved in these communal spaces. Hygiene was intertwined with life events. Weddings, festivals, religious ceremonies, and social gatherings were occasions for extra washing, grooming, and laundering of clothing. Cleanliness wasn't constant. It was intensified around important events. People knew that presenting themselves in a tidy and pleasant way reflected both social respect and moral standing. Even if daily hygiene was limited, major events motivated attention to personal care. Food, drink, and table manners were also linked to hygiene and culture. Washing hands before meals, using clean utensils, and keeping cooking areas tidy were valued practices. In wealthier homes, there were strict routines for table hygiene, including washing dishes, utensils, and hands. In towns, public eating often involved similar habits, though less formal. Clean hands, proper washing, and careful handling of food were signs of civility. Community attitudes played a role too. Neighbors noticed each other's cleanliness or lack thereof. Bad smells could lead to social disapproval, while well-kept homes, clean clothing, and fragrant herbs gained approval. Hygiene was both personal and social. It affected comfort, reputation, and relationships. Even small practices like airing bedding, sprinkling herbs, or washing garments could influence how others perceived you. Children learned hygiene culturally as well as practically. Families taught routines, habits, and moral lessons. Washing hands, combing hair, airing bedding, and bathing occasionally were all part of growing up. Children learned that cleanliness reflected discipline, respectability, and social awareness. These lessons were reinforced by observation, community expectations, and religious teachings. Even attitudes toward waste management were shaped by culture. Proper disposal of human waste, keeping streets clean, and using privies correctly were not only practical but also socially expected. Town regulations, moral teachings, and neighborly pressure encouraged these behaviors. Cultural norms created a framework for hygiene that extended beyond personal preference to community responsibility. Clothing hygiene was similarly influenced by cultural expectations. People changed shifts or undergarments regularly, aired outer clothing, and sometimes added herbs to fabrics. Clean clothing wasn't just practical. It signaled respectability, status, and attention to personal care. Social expectations motivated people to maintain hygiene, even when full bathing was rare. The perception of odors was particularly important. Bad smells were socially unacceptable, morally suspect, and sometimes believed to be dangerous. Herbs, incense, and aromatic oils were used to mask unpleasant odors. Public baths, airing bedding, and laundering garments all contributed to acceptable smells. Cultural pressure reinforced these practices, encouraging regular attention to hygiene and comfort. Interestingly, medieval attitudes could be contradictory. Cleanliness was valued, but excessive concern about appearance or indulgence in baths could be criticized. People balanced practicality, morality, and social norms, creating a unique cultural approach to hygiene. They developed habits that were effective, socially acceptable, and sometimes enjoyable, all without modern plumbing or soap. In summary, cultural attitudes shaped medieval hygiene in multiple ways. Religion linked cleanliness to morality and spiritual purity. Social class influenced access to baths and laundering. Gender roles, life events, and community expectations affected daily practices. Attitudes toward smells, waste, clothing, and public behavior reinforced routines. Even with limited scientific understanding, cultural norms ensured that hygiene mattered for comfort, health, and reputation. Medieval people didn't have modern conveniences, but they understood the importance of cleanliness in a social, moral, and practical context. Herbs, baths, laundering, airing bedding, and washing routines were all part of a culturally informed approach to hygiene. Cleanliness was not just personal, it was social, moral, and practical, and it shaped everyday life in remarkable ways. The next chapter will conclude the book by tying together all the elements of medieval hygiene: bathing, laundry, herbs, waste management, sleep, and cultural attitudes, showing how people managed to survive, stay comfortable, and even thrive in a world without modern conveniences. Chapter 16, Conclusion: Lessons from Medieval Hygiene. After exploring the messy, smelly, and sometimes hilarious world of medieval hygiene, we finally arrive at the big picture. Life in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly sparkling clean, but people were far from careless. Through bathing, laundry, herbal remedies, waste management, sleep routines, and cultural habits, medieval people created a surprisingly effective system to stay as clean and healthy as possible. One of the first lessons is that resourcefulness was key. Without modern plumbing, running water, or chemical disinfectants, people had to improvise. Rivers, streams, public baths, straw mattresses, herbs, and simple basins were all tools in their hygiene toolbox. They made do with what they had, learned through trial and error, and gradually discovered practices that actually worked, even if the reasoning wasn't always scientific. Herbs were a medieval multi-tool. Lavender, rosemary, rue, chamomile, and sage were used everywhere. In baths, sprinkled on straw, added to laundry, and even chewed or brewed for minor ailments. Not only did these herbs smell nice, but they helped repel pests, soothe skin, and make life a little more pleasant. Medieval people may not have had bug spray, but herbs served as an effective stand-in. Bathing, despite being less frequent than today, was an important part of hygiene. Public bathhouses provided a communal space to scrub, soak, and relax, while home washing and basins allowed for daily upkeep of hands, face, and feet. Warm water, herbal infusions, and even small scrubbing routines were surprisingly effective at keeping dirt, sweat, and parasites at bay. While moralists sometimes criticized baths for encouraging vanity or flirtation, most people recognized their practical benefits. Laundry and clothing care were equally important. Changing shifts, airing blankets and garments, and adding herbs helped reduce lice, fleas, and unpleasant odors. Even peasants understood the need to rotate bedding and clean clothing when possible. Clean clothes weren't just about comfort, they were about health, social perception, and personal pride. Washing and airing garments may have been labor-intensive, but the payoff in comfort and protection from pests was worth it. Waste management, though crude by today's standards, was surprisingly systematic. Privies, pits, cesspits, chamber pots, and rules about street cleanliness all contributed to controlling human waste. People understood that filth, smells, and contamination spread disease, even if they didn't know germs existed. Simple practices, like covering waste with soil or ash, helped reduce odors and the presence of pests. Towns and cities often regulated waste disposal, showing that hygiene was both personal and communal. Sleep hygiene was another area where medieval people paid attention. Beds were simple but practical, with straw or feather mattresses, blankets, and herbal sachets. Nightwear was washed when possible, bedding was aired and sprinkled with herbs, and rooms were ventilated to reduce pests and improve comfort. Clean bodies, clean bedding, and pest control all combined to help people sleep better, which in turn supported health and well-being. Medical beliefs, although sometimes strange to us now, also guided hygiene practices. Humor theory, miasma theory, and herbal remedies shaped routines for washing, bathing, and pest control. People knew that foul air, filth, and insects caused illness, or at least were associated with it, so they adapted their behavior accordingly. Hand washing, cleaning tools, bathing, and airing rooms were all influenced by these medical ideas, and they often worked. Cultural attitudes reinforced these practices. Cleanliness was linked to morality, social status, and reputation. Families taught children how to wash, groom, and care for clothing and bedding. Public perception mattered. Neighbors noticed dirty homes, foul smells, and unkempt bodies. Religious teachings tied hygiene to spiritual purity, emphasizing that caring for the body was part of discipline and devotion. Social norms, morality, and practical necessity all came together to shape medieval hygiene. Another key lesson is that hygiene was multi-layered. People didn't rely on just one practice. They combined bathing, laundry, herbs, waste management, sleeping routines, and diet to stay healthy. Each element reinforced the others. For example, bathing removed sweat and dirt, laundry prevented lice infestations, airing bedding reduced pests, herbs repelled insects and odors, and proper waste disposal minimized contamination. It was a system, not isolated actions. Despite challenges, crowded streets, limited water, pests, and disease, medieval people were innovative. They observed what worked, shared knowledge in communities, and sometimes combined superstition, religion, and practical measures to improve hygiene. Even without soap, antibiotics, or plumbing, they managed to survive, reduce discomfort, and maintain relative cleanliness. Looking back, we can appreciate their practical ingenuity. They may not have known about germs, but their routines often targeted real problems: parasites, odors, and skin irritation. Herbs, airing, washing, and waste management had tangible benefits. Medieval hygiene may seem primitive, but it was a carefully developed system adapted to the resources, knowledge, and social context of the time. Medieval hygiene also teaches us about resilience and adaptation. People face challenges we don't even consider today. Crowded homes, shared beds, public streets, and limited access to clean water. They responded with routines, communal solutions, and simple technology. Their practices remind us that human ingenuity can make life tolerable and even comfortable in difficult circumstances. Finally, medieval hygiene reminds us of the importance of observation, experience, and social learning. People learned from neighbors, parents, religious institutions, and trial and error. Herbs were passed down, bathing routines adapted, bedding rotated, and waste management refined over generations. Knowledge wasn't written in textbooks. It was lived, shared, and practiced daily. In conclusion, medieval hygiene was a combination of practical care, social norms, religious teachings, and medical beliefs. Baths, laundry, herbal remedies, waste management, sleep routines, and cultural expectations all contributed to a surprisingly sophisticated system. People were creative, observant, and adaptive, and their routines kept them relatively healthy and comfortable in a challenging world. So, while we may laugh at some of the smells, pests, and odd beliefs, there's a lot to admire. Medieval people didn't have modern plumbing, soap, or running water, but they managed to survive, thrive, and even enjoy small luxuries like scented herbs, warm baths, and clean bedding. Their ingenuity, adaptation, and dedication to hygiene are lessons we can still appreciate today. Even in a world full of dirt, disease, and discomfort, they found ways to keep clean, protect health, and live with dignity. And that's the brutal, fascinating, and sometimes hilarious truth about medieval hygiene.